Welcome to another episode in the series from the Wounded Angel Network called A Radical Christ. And you'll remember that we're looking at the life of Jesus as an archetypal map for every one of our human lives, and that his life breaks down into stages. So there are like sections or provinces of this map. And we're currently busy with the preparation. Then there's the ministry, then there's the failure, and then there's the integration. So this is phase one, and this is the second episode. Last week we looked at the whole idea of annunciation, and to have an angel come, which is also a projection of our own greater self. Our super self is that angelic messenger, and how one integrates that. Today, following a kind of a rosary approach where, every 10 Hail Marys is a specific theme, we're looking at the incarnation, the actual birth of Jesus. Incarnation literally means infleshment. Carne is flesh, so incarnation is the taking on of flesh. And as we've been saying, incarnation could be interpreted as a reversal of the excarnation, when we took our consciousness, when we first became aware of consciousness and projected it outwards, because it was too overwhelming to believe that it could all be in here. We put it on the rocks, we put it on the streams, we put it on the mountain, we put it on fire, and then from there we put it into the earth, into Gaia. The whole earth was God, Mother Earth. The idea of Gaia, in African religion, God lives underground. God lives in caves and in the earth. Gods like Tamata and Nkulunkulu, the greatest one, they live in the earth. And so when the Christian missionaries came, they had this whole challenge to try and move God from out of the earth into the heavens, to get their message to work for Africans. And then from the earth God, or the God in the earth, the projection continued. So the Greeks then create their Olympus. God lives on the mountain, and there are the gods that we all know of: Zeus, Apollo, Demeter, and so on. All of these gods, they're actually just big humans. Zeus behaves terribly. And I mean, even Jehovah in the Old Testament, Carl Jung, in his answer to Job, has written profoundly about how this Jehovah God of the Old Testament is actually capricious and moody and shocking, and there's a lot of shadow there. So that's the Olympian God, the God of the mountain, Mount Zion, Mount Olympus, doesn't really matter. And then as we become more aware of how vast the universe is, we push this God image further and further out, firstly into the stars, the constellations, and now we start seeing the gods in the stars. So you have Apollo, and you have these configurations of Sagittarius and Cancer, and also we name the stars after God. So you have Saturn and Mars and Pluto, the god of darkness. And so you can sense this excarnation, this expansion. So the incarnation is the opposite of that. It's of bringing the divine from however far we've pushed it out, away from ourselves. Because don't forget, the further you push God away, the more holy you make God, the more inaccessible that God becomes. And that explains why we then need intermediaries and saints, and this level that we have to go through, this ladder to reach this unattainable God that we've projected so far out. In the excarnation, so in the incarnation, all of this now comes home, and it actually drives the theologians insane. What's happened is, in fact, consciously we've gone full circle. We've done what T.S. Eliot said so beautifully in Little Gidding: you will come to the place that you've been before, but you'll see it as before. So in the incarnation of Jesus, our consciousness, our human consciousness, comes back to say, God lives within us. God is us. We are God. Consciousness in us, because everything has just come out of our minds. I mean, there's no religion's fallen out of the sky. All religion, remember, has come as part of human conversation. So the incarnation now drives the theologians insane, because they've made God so holy and so remote, they can't conceive of putting that big God, that huge God, back inside a human form. And so there's this whole doctrine that develops called Kenosis, which is literally means emptying. So that God had to sort of give up certain parts, and they did all sorts of philosophical and theological flick-flacks to make that idea work. Because of course you can't have Jesus running the universe from his cradle. At the same time, you've got to allow for God to be messing into his diapers. You see the problem. Of course, all just a construct of our own minds, and we create those problems because of the excarnation, and now having to reincarnate, reintegrate it back into human life. But so it was this whole confused state. If you want to read more about it, if you go to Philippians chapter 2, there's this very interesting V where you see the kenosis. And so Christ did not consider being equal with God a thing to be grasped. And so he emptied himself. There it is. He emptied himself, taking upon himself the form of a slave. He humbled himself even unto death, death on the cross. Dead. Therefore, God has exalted him. And here comes the excarnation again. From that point of death and the resurrection, which we'll get to, comes this God has highly exalted him, giving him a name above all other names. Yes, back into heaven again. You can see the V. Christ humbling in the kenosis into the incarnation. But the moment the church gets a chance, puts him back into heaven again. Makes the break. So what is the incarnation, the enfleshment? What does this part of Jesus' life have to say as part of my map? What does it point to? How can it help me in any kind of therapeutic way, any kind of healing way, which is really what a Radical Christ series is about? How can it heal me? How can it heal the earth? Well, firstly, it's a return of our own divinity. Having been robbed or having given away our divinity. And please remember, we're not judging anybody in history for what has happened. It had to happen this way. I often say in therapy, never judge what you did then by what you know now. Because you didn't know then what you know now. And if you hadn't have done then what you did then, you wouldn't know what you know now. You get that? So let's not judge this whole process of excarnation to return to incarnation. It was a natural development and evolution of human consciousness. But where we are today, our understanding of this myth of the incarnation, the God who becomes human, is a restoration of the divinity of our own being and the divinity of our consciousness. And by the way, consciousness is not just our mind. Consciousness is our whole psychic reality. It's our psychology, it's our consciousness, and it's not just my consciousness, it's the collective unconscious, and it is in fact the whole of life, the psychic reality of life in all its fullness, in every plant, in every virus. It's all of life. So it's a return of that divinity, and we need to also be very clear that the story of Jesus, the myth of Jesus, the true story, that's what a myth is, right? A true story that might just not have happened the way it's told. The story of Jesus, the Christ, is not a unique story. In fact, it's been closely modeled on some ancient stories that predate the Jesus story by millennia. If you go and look at the Egyptian Horus, if you look at various ancient cultural stories, the God becoming human, born of a virgin, heralded by angels, it's all there. So this is not a unique story, but it is the most accessible story for us who have grown up in a Western culture. So it's an accessible story but it's not the only story, but it's the same universal truth. Consciousness projected itself outward and created gods. The gods have now come back in incarnation. So when we're talking about this human life, so this incarnation, we have this very interesting meeting of the Abrahamic cults, religions, the Abrahamic religions, the religions of the book. So in order of history, you have Judaism, you have Christianity, you have Islam, all basically using the same scriptures from the Middle East. With a God up there in heaven. And then in the Far East, you have the Advaitic Hindu religion, and you have coming out of that Buddhism in its various forms. So in the Abrahamic faiths, there's a conception of a sort of one shot at this life. This is the life. Depending on how you live this life, you will be judged, and you will then get a reward out of this world in another life, but that'll be an eternal life. In the East, they have a different view, and that is that this life that you are living now is just one of what could be thousands of reincarnations that you have had. And depending on the system you're working with, you can be reborn in various forms. So you can be reborn into heavenly realms where it's actually harder to become enlightened because you've got no pain, or you can be born into hell realms where you just struggle so hard every day you haven't got time to think about improving yourself or burning off your karma. But it's a cyclic repeat. Or you could even have a system where you could come back as a cockroach, or you could come back as a cow or a tree or a mosquito. So to get a human life is very precious. Now what I found fascinating is where you have this multiplicity of lives in the reincarnation model, those very religions are the ones that treat life as being far more sacred than the religions that have this one-shot approach of the Abrahamic faiths. Life for the Buddhists and the Hindus is incredibly precious, and here's the reason why. For them, the chance of getting a human life as opposed to an animal or a plant life or in a different hell realm or a heavenly realm, to get a human life, the best kind of life to work on getting enlightenment, it's so precious for them. They describe it in the Buddhist scriptures. It's described as being this rare. Listen to this story. Imagine there's a vast ocean. Can you see the ocean? On the ocean is floating a single plank, a wooden plank floating on the ocean. Can you see the plank? In the plank, there's a knothole where a branch grew out, and now there's a knothole in the plank floating on top of the ocean. Can you see that? The bottom of the ocean lives a single turtle. This vast, vast ocean, as big as all of the world's oceans. It lives one turtle. Every 1,000 years, this turtle surfaces and sticks its head out of the water and then goes down again for another 1,000 years. Here it comes. The rarity of getting a human life is as rare as the chances of the turtle, when it surfaces, putting its head through the knothole of that singular plank floating on the vast ocean. That's how precious it is. And I just love that what we have here, this life, this incarnation, the incarnation of Jesus as our map and our model. He's the way we want to live. He's the way we want to live out this life more skillfully. And I'll come to the 3 reasons why we follow religions in a moment. But Jesus as that map is because this is so precious. We borrow that from the East, and we say this is a precious life. Jesus' life in our narrative was over by the time he was 33. I've had almost double that amount of time. And if truth be told, I haven't practiced it all that skillfully. I've had moments, but I've also had terribly, terribly unskillful, stupid times when I literally have gone backwards. But the good news is, just like Incarnation, Excarnation, and T.S. Eliot, we come back to the place that we've seen before, and perhaps we're a little wiser, and we see it, albeit as if for the first time. So, now that God is back in us, now that I am an incarnation of the divine, God in us, says Paul, the hope of glory, God in us, brings us to the question of what to do. Well, in the Christian narrative, we follow Jesus. Notice that Jesus says, I think it's 19 times in the Gospels, follow me. He never once says, worship me. But in classical disobedience, and because it's so much more easy and financially viable, let's rather worship Jesus than follow him, because to follow Jesus is so difficult, because he makes so many demands upon us, and I'll talk about the 3 steps of the reasons why we follow any religion. To worship Jesus is far easier. You just take him, put him back in heaven, make him completely irrelevant and up there, visit him on Sundays. And by the way, I was reading something this week about how utilitarian we can sometimes become, as to like, what is the minimum amount of following I have to do to make the cut to get the next life? That one shot thing to make the cut and get into heaven. And there was a Jesuit in the 16th century, he actually worked it out, that you only have to give your life to Jesus 4 times in your whole lifetime. You only have to doff your cap 4 times. And he had it all worked out, that there was a time when you got baptized, and then when you were confirmed, and this kind of thing. And just before you die, if you do it 4 times, you're in. It's guaranteed. Now that's just ridiculous. However, if I am the Christ, and this is Christ living in me, and I am an incarnation, you see, we Christians actually do believe in reincarnation. What do you say? Reincarnation for Christians? Yes. If we take the gospel seriously, every one of us is reincarnating Jesus in our own life. That's reincarnation. Not excarnation, not putting Jesus over there, but allowing our life to become a reincarnation of the life that we have in the Jesus story, that archetypal life. So the question is, now that God is incarnated rather than excarnated, God is incarnated in us, how do we work with that? What do we do with that? And there's a very helpful clip that I want to introduce from a extended series that has been done by Tenzin Palmo, Jetson Tenzin Palmo, most famously known as the British Tibetan Buddhist woman who spent 12 years in a retreat in the Himalayas in a cave. Her famous book is called Cave in the Snow. She's probably one of the most senior Buddhist nuns currently in the world. An extraordinary human being. But listen what she has to say about the 3 motivations for religious practice, and then I'll come back to that after she's explained her dream, and I'll just go over it one more time. Enjoy Tenzin Palmo.
Now, in Mahayana Buddhism, I mean, basically, okay, there are three motivations for the spiritual life. The first is that we practice because we are hoping it's going to make us feel better. I mean, none of these motivations are bad. I mean, they're all fine, but each one is a little deeper. So the first motivation, which many people do for religion, is because they hope it's going to benefit me, especially in this life. Or if not in this lifetime, next lifetime I can go to heaven. And so always the motivation is that somehow or other we're going to make samsara more comfortable. And most people, when they go to church or to the temple or to the mosque, the basic idea is that it not only makes them feel better now, but they will be rewarded in the future. And so that is what keeps people, being kind, being generous, and so forth. But mostly it's based on the desire that somehow it's going to make us feel better and that we're going to get the reward for that. Then the second motivation is recognizing that actually, even if one goes up into heaven from a Hindu Buddhist point of view, you're going to come down again. And back into the wheel. I mean, heaven is still part of the wheel. It's not beyond the wheel. And so, therefore, we're endlessly gyrating around. And one never knows where one is going to be next time, depending on our actions of body, speech, and mind in this life. Next lifetime is, going to be how it's going to be. And like being in a huge prison. Really, samsara is like a prison. One time I had a dream. And I dreamt that I was in this huge prison, infinite. And in the top floor, it had many, many floors, many, many rooms. And in the top floor, in the penthouse suite, there were people partying, laughing, drinking, having a great time. And then on other levels, people working, people laughing, people crying, people fighting, people loving, until the dungeons where people were in the deepest despair and tortured. But I realized that whether one was in the penthouse or the dungeons, it was a prison. And what is more, the fact that the people who were in the penthouse now didn't mean that they were going to stay in the penthouse. They could come down. And everybody was changing their positions. And so I thought, this is terrible. It's so dangerous. We've got to get out. And so I spoke to several of my friends and other people, and I said, look, this is a prison. We've got to escape. And people said, yeah, well, it's a prison, but it's okay. It's not so bad. And then other people said, well, yes, but it's so difficult to get out. How are we going to get out? Let's not even try. But eventually, I found a few friends who said, well, all right, we'll go if you go. So running through this prison, there was this stream. And on the bank was this kind of flat boat. And there were guards, but the guards didn't try to stop us. And so we got in the boat, and then the boat sailed down the stream, and then we were on the outside of the prison. And we started running. And we were running and running. I was running, and then the others behind me, running. And on my left was this huge building of the prison, and all these endless windows lighted, showing exactly people partying, people crying, people laughing, people working, all the different occupations which we can go through. Each window was a vignette of a different activity. And so I was running, and the prison was endless. And I was so tired, exhausted. And I thought, they're right. This prison is endless. And what's the point? I'm just exhausting myself, not getting anywhere. It's never coming to an end. Really, better just go back into the prison. And so this idea of trying to get out of the prison and escape is the second motivation, that we want to enter into nirvana for ourselves and be liberated from that prison of samsara. So I was on the point of turning round and going back when I thought, oh, but I'm not the only one running. My friends are also running. If I stop and go back, they also will stop and go back. Therefore, for their sake, I have to keep running. And as soon as I stopped thinking about myself escaping and thought of the reason I was really getting out of prison was also to help my friends get out of prison, then the prison came to the end. And the dream went on, but it's not important at this point. So the third motivation is that we are practicing the spiritual path in order that we may help others also to be liberated.
Well, the first is that we do it for ourselves, because we believe that if we follow a faith, it'll be good for us. It'll make us better people. It'll make us serve. It'll serve us. It'll make us better people. And of course, that's why we want to do it. We look at Jesus, we think, I'd like to be like that. I follow that religion. And by doing that, I try to tame my wild and chaotic life. And I try to get it to run on some kind of rail. So that's the first, is self-interest. The second is that we do it for that reward that I spoke about. Whether it's a reincarnational model where you're doing this precious human life for the 1000th time, you're still doing it in the hope that in this life you will burn off all the karma and make it to nirvana, or in the Abrahamic model that you'll do enough, not just the 4 times maybe of the Jesuits in the 16th century, but that you will become somebody that will attain the reward. So there's making myself a better person, number 1. Number 2 is for reward. The third one, if one goes deeper and is truly transformed by one's faith, which is what I hope we are on the journey doing here in these conversations. If one goes deeper, not just thinking about making yourself a better person, getting the reward, the third one comes to developing what the old Bible calls charity. Now, have you noticed that doing it for yourself and then for the reward, and then for love and loving others, doing it for others, can actually line up with faith, hope, and love. These 3 things remain. 1 Corinthians 13. Faith, hope, and charity in the old translation. Do it for yourself, you believe, and then eventually, hopefully, you kenoso, you know, rather than just believe the dogma. You experience it. Number 2, you hope in the reward, faith, hope, charity. You then begin to do it for others. Best described probably as altruism. That you start living your life not just for yourself and for the reward, but you start living it so that others can benefit from it with you. And it's here that we completely align with our Buddhist friends and with Buddhism, where they talk about you practice bodhicitta. Bodhicitta is that compassion, that altruism, which makes the whole world a better place. So those then are the benefits of the divine entering into us and us becoming the incarnations, the reincarnations of Jesus. And so I invite you to spend some time just thinking about how you can see and how you can practice the manifestation of the Christ, the radical Christ, living in and through every action, every fiber, every thought, every attitude of your own life. Thank you for your attention, and I'll see you next time.